Hello, everyone. My name is Age Mace, and I'm really excited to be here today and talk to you about anarcho-primitivism. Anarcho-primitivism is a fringe sect, I'll call it, of anarcho-communism that argues in favor of returning to differing extents, depending on who you ask, a relatively primitive way of existence. And by primitive, they mean hunting and gathering and perhaps tribal living, according to some people. And, while I think there are varying degrees of validity to the arguments, I think there is a lot that we can learn from the ideas that are being spoken about within this framework. So the next conversation that I'm going to get into talks about how ought we to organize society, how ought we to have the discussions, and what are the ends that we're really talking about. And that's really what I mean. What ends ought we to pursue? What ends ought we to organize ourselves around? And how do we define them? For me, and what I think humanity, to speak generally, ought to pursue is an affluent society, an affluent life for each individual. Now, what do I mean by affluency? By affluency, I am referring to the idea that any individual's materials wants are easily satisfied. Now, there are, according to one thinker that I'm going to get into a little bit later, Marshall Solins, there are two roads to affluency. One is wanting little, or two is producing a lot. Obviously, in our current pursuit of affluency, we have chosen the latter. And this is the solution that capitalism offers. It is a valid solution. Essentially, capitalists will tell you that capitalism is the ideal proxy for representing this road to affluency by providing proper incentives, financially or otherwise, to individuals in their pursuit. And efforts made in this pursuit are rewarded monetarily, and thus enabling you to live a better life within a capitalist society. There are alternatives. As I said, the other road is simply wanting less. And that is what anarcho-primitivism really fixates on. And I think it's an incredibly powerful idea that enables a lot of really interesting conversations that we're going to get into over the next however many minutes. But what more do humans need to live a fulfilling life, so to speak? One really powerful idea, courtesy of Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, he writes in his manifesto about something called the power process. The power process, as he explains it, is the idea that in order for humans to go through life fulfilled, they need to have a goal towards which they may work. And now we're going to get into how exactly this manifests and what are the consequences of not fulfilling this. Thank you. Now, to continue our discussion, I first want to communicate to you what I believe to be the true foundation of the anarcho-primitivist position. Anarcho-primitivism rests heavily on what they call a reappraisal of the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. Now, what do they mean by this? I'm sure all of you would agree that the modern outlook on the hunter-gatherer / primitivist lifestyle is quite poor. Hobbes described man in the state of nature as living a life that was nasty, brutish, and short, and living in a perpetual war of every man against every man. And this is consistent. We still read Hobbes, and we find Leviathan very relevant to how we organize socially, and so on. And so for these reasons, again, people have quite low standards for the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. This is shifting, however, and I think that is what this rests on. Again, this reappraisal of the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. This reappraisal comes from a lot of anthropological work from the 60s. And what this anthropological work told us, this included both studies of archaeological nature, where They are digging up humans and able to tell us about how they lived, how long they lived, and so on, as well as actual research into societies that were at the time and still now uh, living a hunter-gatherer life, both in the Kalahari Desert as well as the Australian outback. Those are the primary examples. And what was found was um, they lived in a sort of affluence. They lived in a sort of abundance where their wants were inherently limited. Now, what do I mean by this? Today, I go through life thinking, "Oh man, I really want that one T-shirt that I saw. I really want this pair of shoes, man. I've been thinking about this pair of shoes forever." Um, and that's only because I'm familiar with X, Y, or Z. Now, the hunter-gatherer position is a very different position. It's an incredibly different position in that they haven't seen a pair of shoes. They haven't seen anything that is beyond their hey guys.
What up? Working on a project?
Yeah.
What is it for?
Anarcho-Primitivism.
Class?
Yeah, the class is just social and political philosophy.
Cool. What are you doing?
Talking about how the hunter-gatherer lifestyle can tell us a lot about how to live sustainably and what we can take from them.
Sounds interesting.
Yeah.
What school are you going to?
Villanova.
Good luck.
Thanks, man. Have a good one. As I was saying, their wants are inherently limited by the condition in which they live. They are familiar with the 75 odd berries and the animals that live around them. A Tunisian man living a million years ago could have no conception of an Alaskan salmon and therefore could not have a desire for Alaskan salmon. And because their wants are inherently limited, everything they know around them, everything they could possibly want around them, is immediately available to them. And that is the beauty of the hunter-gatherer position. I only know what I can have. And I can effectively, quite easily, get what I would desire. I can go pick a tree, a little bit more laborious. I can go, me and my buddies can go try and catch this saber-toothed tiger, or something of that nature. Although it should be mentioned that hunting itself was actually a relatively late introduction to the lifestyle, and much of the meat that was eaten, which was very limited, they did not eat very much meat, was mostly scavenged, and they largely relied on plants. The Kalahari Bushman, for example, I think had approximately 75 odd endemic species that they were able to live on. And to provide some accurate statistics as to what this means and how can we compare this to our way of living, you'll tell me, but age, I can go to Whole Foods and I can get way more than 75 different things to eat. And now this is in the context of a highly developed nation that relies on very problematic structures to enable us to have mangoes year-round. We shouldn't be eating mangoes year-round. But nevertheless, I digress. What I want to mention now is that data indicates that the hours spent per day on food-connected activities for hunter-gatherer societies average between 4 to 5 hours. This, of course, does not include the actual cooking or the eating of the food itself, but involves all the labor in a day required to go out and make sure that you can eat and live. Now think about all the activity, energy, and time you have to spend in order to make sure that you have food on your table today. We no longer go out and pick things off trees. We go to work. Work, of course, does not give us our groceries. It gives us money, which is a tool to go and get our groceries. So many people work 8, 9, 10-hour days at work. That's quite standard today in America. And this does not include all of the time that you also spend to ensure that you can upkeep this routine. What do I mean by that? I mean, that does not include your commuting time. That does not include any errands you have to run in order to keep your job, dry cleaning, car maintenance, anything like that. And nor does it include the time that you actually need to go and get groceries from the grocery store. So all in all, we're actually exerting ourselves even more so and spending significantly much more time in order to ensure that we can simply live, in order to ensure that I eat the number of calories that I ought to be eating. I'm quoting here from Marshall Sahlins, The Original Affluent Society. The ratio of food producers to the general population is actually 3 to 5 or 2 to 3. But these 65% of people worked 36% of the time. And 35% of the people did not work at all. So this obviously enables a significant more amount of leisure time relative to what we have now in society. The next section that I'm going to get into is if we had it so good, why did we transition to agriculture? What are the possible reasons for that? What are the conditions for that? And what did that process look like? What were the immediate consequences? So we lived like this for millions of years, as many accounts have said. Hunting, gathering, collecting berries, everything and the like, with lots of free time to sing, dance, embroider, or do nothing. And if we had it so good, which is what anarcho-primitivists will tell you, why did we give it up for agriculture and everything that came with? Well, the most plausible answer that many people acknowledge is that the transition from gathering to agriculture is the consequence of religion. Many believe that planting a seed was first and foremost a ceremonial act, a religious act. This is reaffirmed by the fact that sheep and goats were some of the first domesticated animals, and they were largely used for sacrificial reasons. But of course, once you start milking the goat, you start to appreciate its value, and it becomes something of a commodity. It becomes a cog. And we'll get into how that process works in a little bit, but not everyone shares the same religion, so why did this catch on? Imagine you're a gatherer, and you stumble upon a giant field of corn. Wow. I mean, the temptation, the sheer volume, the grandeur of so much food is hard to deny. And so anyone that sees that is likely to go back to their camp and tell them, "Hey guys, look, I found this giant field of corn. I think we can plant the seeds." And so, as such, many people start to recognize the immediate value in that, and so onwards they proceed. Now we'll get into the actual consequences and what living in early agricultural societies was like in a little bit, but even if someone didn't want to live like that, the plausibility is high that what really happened is under agriculture, you can sustain larger and larger populations, and you build armies, you have class, and everything that comes with. And what that means is, as the famous saying goes, might makes right. Big stick diplomacy. If I have the biggest army in town, it doesn't matter whether I'm subjugating these people to a lower standard of living than you go through. You lose, and I win, and that's how the cookie crumbles. And so, what I want to talk about next is the actual consequences of this. What is the lived experience of early agricultural society, as well as early industry, and so on? Anarcho-primitivists create this distinction between tools and technology, and I think it's a very, very helpful one that enables us to understand how early humans engage with the world around them and compare that to how we do now. Tools are an object made by a single individual or the cooperation of few individuals on a single occasion. What does that mean? That means spears, canoes, something that anyone is capable of understanding how it's made and can perhaps make it themselves with the help of maybe a few other people. Technology, on the other hand, I think we can define as large-scale interlocking systems of extraction, production, distribution, and consumption. What happens with technology is it sort of gains a momentum of its own, and it starts to grow, and people slowly choose to accept it as a greater and greater role in their lives, and eventually you lose that choice. It has become such a big part of our lives that we have to engage with it. And ultimately, these technologies grow so large that no one person can fully understand or even control what is happening. And in that, the moment you have technology, you yourself become controlled by it. In agriculture, what does that look like? That looks like, great, I just found out about this brand new thing called planting. I got this whole field of corn. I'm gonna have so much corn, great. Now I need to get up every morning. I need to till the field. I need to look after the corn. And as such, it becomes an obligation. It becomes, to go to the furthest extent, it becomes enslavement to agriculture, enslavement to technology. All this work in the name of efficiency, one may say as much that for the Neolithic, as John Stuart Mill said, of all labor-saving devices, never was one invented that saved anyone a minute's labor. And this is further exemplified by the fact that with all our technology, we're working longer and harder, maybe not harder in modern industrial society, but harder in the global periphery, in the global south, than we ever have before. As a modern example, I think a really powerful one that Ted Kaczynski provides is the example of the car. Way back when it was first introduced, many people considered the car a luxury, a nice alternative to walking or horseback riding. If I want to save up the money, I can do that and I can have a car. Along with its benefits and pros and cons, that was a choice that I could make or I could not make. However, as cars become a larger and larger part of society, cities begin to develop in such a way that you effectively need a car. Nobody now in the US, for the most part, lives within walking distance of their work, of their grocery store, or of any of the things they want to do besides the things that they must. And in essence, the car no longer becomes a choice. It becomes a necessity. And that is how most technology goes. Same with phones. Once an easier way to talk to people, now become the only way to talk to people. Another really interesting theory that Kaczynski gets into is the bastardization of this power process. The power process that I mentioned being the need for an individual to have goals to achieve in order to feel fulfilled. Ted Kaczynski talks about what he calls surrogate activities, excuse me. Now, surrogate activity is one which he designates as an activity that is directed towards an artificial goal that people set up for themselves merely in order to have some goal to work towards. Now, this is effectively everything we do to simply have the goal of X amount of money in your bank account is merely to have a goal to work towards. And in industrial technological society, we have been effectively reduced to cogs. We are given surrogate activities in order to feel some form of satisfaction, but that comes at many costs, many personal costs, which I will get into in just a moment. But I want to talk about the decreased quality of life now. The decreased quality of life in early agriculture, as well as modern living.
American anthropologist George Armelagos, whose studies indicate that agriculture directly contributed to a nearly 50% increase in enamel defects indicative of malnutrition, a fourfold increase in iron deficiency anemia, a threefold increase in bone lesions reflecting infectious disease, and an increase in degenerative conditions of the spine. Um, that is a clear indication that people lived worse in early agriculture than they did in hunter-gatherers. Under indentured living, you have much more rampant disease, as you're simply living with more people, and the more people there are, the more likely you are to catch something from somebody. Additionally, you no longer have the grand variety that hunter-gatherers lived on. The 75 plants of the Kalahari that I mentioned earlier becomes more like three: wheat, rice, corn, and easily scalable carbohydrates. Now, what does that mean? That means that you are much, much more likely to have famine, to have poor crop yields, to have starvation, uh, and everything that comes with. Um, as for the reduction in life quality today, technology, Zoom meetings, and everything means we don't see as many people. The more time you spend in your car or at your computer, the less time um, you're in the park with someone else, or walking around, doing anything else that you might want to do. Additionally, this technological development has come at a massive ecological cost, as we are all incredibly well aware of, and that will be the next topic of discussion. Thank you.
So now for the environment. And concretely what I want to talk about is how we engage with the environment, how we view the environment, and nature in general. Um, a concept that I find is really pertinent to this particular discussion, as well as any ecological or climatological discussion, is that of Marx's metabolic rift. Now, what do I mean when I say metabolic rift? Um, well, as you might deduce, he's talking about a metabolism, a need uh, to consume. What Marx says is that society, uh, global society, and humans, and not just humans, but any population, anything that lives, has to live off of something. And he talks primarily about the human metabolism and what we, as a species, consume. Now, there's 8 billion of us, just about, and we consume quite a bit. Um, and the inherent issue with that is that, for one, capitalism propagates this consumption. Its modus operandi, the mode of operating for capitalism, is inducing further and further consumption. Um, that is what the profit incentive dictates, and so that is how the world works. Um, the rift, though, is the break, the distance between what we do consume, how much we consume, and how much we can sustainably consume, so to speak. What is the extent to which Mother Nature affords us a living? Um, and this metabolic rift, the rift between what we consume and how much we ought to consume, um, is massive. It's absolutely extraordinarily massive. And not only are we unsustainably engaging with regenerative resources, um, but we are also effectively hollowing out the earth in such a way that permanently ceases many of these regenerative activities. We chop down loads of trees. It's not like we're just picking too many berries. No more berries are growing. And so this is, for Marx, a huge issue, which ought to be addressed within, for him, a socialist framework. But it is most aptly addressed in a primitivist framework. Overconsumption is very difficult when the global population is a fraction of what it is today. Probably, I would imagine, far less than a billion, presumably within about 10 million people living in the hunter-gatherer context. And it effectively, I mean, we have historical records to indicate that they lived like this for millions of years. Our current practices, especially the industrial ones, are only about 300 years old. And we've already done excessive amounts of damage to Mother Nature and Mother Earth. And so that is the framework from which anarcho-primitivist operates: the unsustainability of modern technological practices and the ability to address that metabolic rift through a primitivist lifestyle. Like, so now for the fun part. What kind of society do we envision for the future? I'm going to get into two different perspectives on this. That of a man named John Zerzan, and that of another man named Murray Bookchin. Now, John Zerzan rests definitely on the most radical end of the scale, even for anarcho-primitivists. But I think what he says is really interesting, and quite compelling, to be frank. So, what Zerzan says is that not only does the domestication of man begin with agriculture in and of itself, it begins before that. He first makes references to time. In the moment that you have a structured day, you begin to think in economic terms. You begin to think in economic terms, and marginal cost, opportunity cost, and all of these things, while they may not exist in that particular framing, that is effectively how one begins to operate throughout the world. And I think there is a significant degree of truth to that. Although he takes it one step further. Not only is time a domesticator of humans, symbolic language in and of itself domesticates man. Because in the moment that you begin to have a conceptual idea, a platonic form, an ideal of something, of anything, whether it be trees, grass, whatever it may be in the world around you, you in that moment, by reducing it down to a verbal stimuli or a sound-based stimuli, you have effectively domesticated that idea. And in turn, that paves the road for agriculture and the true domestication of man as we know it. I find that marginally less compelling, and it begs the question: how far do we go back? Can you really imagine a world where human civilization effectively rolls all the way back to a non-linguistic state? I think that's a little bit far-fetched, to say the least. And I think we ought to be thinking about this, not how far do we go back, but perhaps as how does the future imagine? We ought to be thinking about this in a forward-looking mentality. And so that is where Murray Bookchin comes in with a far more optimistic view. Perhaps too optimistic for some, but why not understand what the ideal is, and then we perhaps strive for that ideal. So what Murray Bookchin offers is that we should not completely abandon everything that we have achieved as a technological society, but that we ought to salvage as much, as he calls it, booty as we can from the wreckage. He of course shares the idea that capitalist and industrial society is effectively doomed. Too many inherent contradictions, and we will slowly through time, as institutions decay, birth rates fall, and there are simply no longer the people to run said institutions, we will slowly rewild. And I think what's key to the forward-looking ideology is that if we don't learn from history, we're bound to repeat it. If we go all the way back to no language, then at some point we may develop language again, and history bound to repeat itself. And so, what Murray Bookchin offers beyond a forward-looking ideology is that we return to tribalism insofar as we abolish our obsession with contracts and replace it with an economy of usufruct and generosity. We see this throughout many cultures still today, a culture of giving without expecting anything back. And of course, as we see it today, we know that this is something humans are capable of, and it's a much more anyone that participates in that will tell you it's a very rewarding sensation. The act of giving can be incredibly powerful, and Murray Bookchin advocates for organizing ourselves around giving as opposed to contractual obligations. We may have some company. Bookchin says humanity is nature rendered self-conscious, that we speak for a fullness of mind that can articulate nature's latent capacity to reflect upon itself, to function within itself as its own corrective and guide. He says, in this conception, we are shown the conflict, the notion that presupposes that we exist sufficiently within nature and sufficiently a part of nature to function on its behalf. Bookchin here is highlighting the issue of ends. Civilization has rarely considered the good of humanity, much less that of nature. We know that to be true. Capitalism prioritizes the accumulation of capital and so on over anything, including human lives. There are many examples of this, in particular, Ford, when he was making more money than he knew what to do with, wanted to raise the wages of his workers and improve their living conditions, but shareholders took him to court and said, you can't do that, that's our money, and the shareholders won. Furthermore, until we rid ourselves of the cafeteria imagery that we must repay nature for its lunches and snacks, our relationship with the biosphere will still be contractual and bourgeois to its core. Now the alternative. Perhaps romantic, Bookchin envisions a world of subsisted communities of about 1,700 people. This number is grounded in Fourier's socialist utopianism, and he actually borrows quite a bit of Fourier's vocabulary and references within the French philosopher's work. Fourier says that 1,700 is precisely the correct number of passionate combinations that are necessary to satisfy each individual's desire. And I think that's a pretty understandable concept in a large city, or even in any normally sized town in America. There are simply too many people for you to really know, and that is the decay of the human connection that empowers the economy of giving. Well, it's really a non-economy, a relationship of giving, we'll call it. And you need to really know the people that you're giving to know what they want. And 1,700, about, enables you to have a much more intimate knowledge of everyone around you, and so on. And so he imagines a world of dotted communities of about that population, um, living off subsistence and community gardens, um, and you know, again, a relatively utopian understanding. Of course, there are, you know, the concept that agriculture has enslaved us does persist there in the community garden. But Bookchin says that at that kind of scale, you are not bound uh, so you're not bound so intimately with the need to continue growing. Of course, the idea is that not all of these community gardens will only have rice and wheat, but they will be local plants, plants that people are familiar with, and a far greater diversity of plants, um, and so on. But the question is, how do we achieve this? How do we get there? Um, Here, Bookchin has an extensive critique of Marx and the means through which socialist parties have attempted to organize themselves and build the state that they envision. And what this bases itself on is something called the prefigurative principle. What the prefigurative principle talks about is the idea that the means through which you wish to achieve an end cannot be contradictory to that end in itself. What does that actually mean? That means that if you wish to achieve a classless society with no hierarchy, you cannot do that by having a hierarchical political party with a leader and so on. And that is the biggest point of anarchism, is that to achieve true autonomy and liberation from oppressive institutions and all that comes with, you effectively need no institutions, and society itself must be brought down organically by the will of many people. And of course, that is likely the downfall of anarchism as a realistic endeavor, as to expect everyone to spontaneously decide that yes, anarchism is the best mode of living. That is how we will live, and we will revolt and build the revolution in this image, is highly unrealistic, highly unrealistic. But I do think that the critiques of Marxism are highly valid. Bookchin believes that Marxism has ceased to be applicable to our time, not because it is too visionary or revolutionary, but because it is not visionary or revolutionary enough. Bookchin takes great issue with Marx's use of the transition from feudalism to capitalism as a comparison to his envisioned transition of capitalism to socialism. To quote, "Can we explain the transition from a class society to a classless society by means of the same dialectic that accounts for the transition of one class society to another?" Furthermore, I think a really powerful critique of Marx is that Bookchin accuses him of trying to turn the world into a giant factory. And what Bookchin praises is that we see this more and more today, perhaps at its peak in the 60s, of the youth smoking pot and not taking work very seriously. And he praises this as an effort to undo their workerness, not to own it, perhaps in the way that Marx envisions. As I mentioned, he has a profound critique of the party, and as a bourgeois institution, a hierarchical institution, it is simply bound to recreate itself. To end, Bookchin says, "Listen, Marxist, the organization we try to build is the kind of society our revolution will create. Either we will shed the past in ourselves, as well as in our groups, or there will simply be no future to win." And I think that really gets to the heart of what anarcho-primitivism is trying to do, to recognize in ourselves what has come of industrial society, widespread chronic illness, depression rampant, and high degrees of inequality, and absolutely ridiculous amounts of exploitation. Climatologists indicate that if you adjust all of the extractive processes and resources that come from them. This includes labor, the resources themselves, as well as the fixed capital that is put into the extractive processes in the global south. It is about $10 trillion on an annual basis, which the global south is robbed of, adjusting for northern prices. That includes copper and all the rare earth minerals that we rely on in the global north to run our lives, has effectively been poached. And such a society is unsustainable at its very core. And so, to reform in ourselves and in our society, we need to understand that first and foremost, and understand the level of alienation which we have experienced, and undo that. Slowly but surely, we will hopefully arrive at a better place. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you've learned something. If not, that's all right too. And enjoy the summer.